According to the oldest accounts, if you wake up in the middle of the night with a sharp stabbing pain between your shoulder blades, you are already out of time. The people who first told this story described the sensation as feeling like you had just been kicked in the back by something massive. Then comes the breathlessness. A sudden, crushing weight presses down on your chest, paralyzing you against the mattress. You try to scream, but your lungs refuse to fill with air. And finally comes the blood. By the time the victim coughs up their first drop of crimson, the entity has already slipped away into the night. It doesn't leave muddy footprints. It doesn't break down doors or shatter windows. In fact, if another person had been standing in the room, they might not have seen a monster at all. Depending on who was looking, they might have just seen an incredibly handsome young man standing quietly at the foot of the bed. But that man is not human. He is an apex predator that arrived on the back of a thunderstorm. The most unsettling part of this legend, however, is not how this creature hunts, nor the horrifying way it drains the life from its victims. It is the fact that this entity does not hunt for itself. It doesn't stalk the night out of blind animal hunger. Someone in your community sent it. They call it the Impundulu. In the languages of the Zulu, Xhosa, and Pondo people of southern Africa, the name translates directly to the lightning bird. It is an entity that exists at the terrifying intersection of atmospheric science, vampirism, and blood magic. And once you understand how it operates, you realize it is arguably the most complex and inescapable entity in all of global mythology. But to understand why people fear it, you first have to understand what happens when it takes to the sky. If you were to witness the Impundulu in its true, unrestrained form, you would see a creature that defies all biological logic. Accounts from traditional lore describe it as a colossal, bird-like entity, roughly the size of a fully grown human being. It possesses a stark, monochromatic black and white plumage that allows it to vanish against the dark, churning backdrop of a storm cloud. However, it is impossible to miss its extremities. The creature has a heavy, razor-sharp beak and massive talons that are the color of fiery, glowing red. Some witnesses throughout history claimed its tail feathers flickered with a strange, iridescent light like sky blue or green fire. When the Impundulu beats its massive wings, it doesn't just displace air. The sheer kinetic force of its wing beats is said to physically generate the deafening cracks of thunder that shake the earth. But that is not its most destructive trait. The creature is practically immune to conventional harm. You cannot shoot it, you cannot drown it, you cannot stab or poison it. It is an immortal force of nature, and it is said that as it plummets toward the earth, it unleashes jagged bolts of lightning directly from its crimson talons. Yet, one detail about its atmospheric reign of terror doesn't quite fit the profile of a standard mythological beast. The Impundulu doesn't just ride the storm for the thrill of the hunt. It uses the lightning as a delivery system. According to deep-rooted folklore, when a particularly violent lightning bolt strikes the ground, it isn't just an electrical discharge. It is the Impundulu descending to bury an egg deep beneath the soil. These subterranean eggs are highly sought after, but incredibly dangerous. Local legends dictate that the exact location of a buried Impundulu egg is often marked by fairy circles, rings of mushrooms sprouting inexplicably in the fields. If a person were brave enough or foolish enough to dig up one of these eggs, they could theoretically harness the storm's power. It is said that by grinding the egg into a fine powder and mixing it with a rare fish that glows in the dark, a person can create a terrifying weapon, a concoction that allows them to call down a targeted lightning strike upon their enemies. But most traditional healers advise destroying the egg immediately, because leaving an Impundulu unchecked invites a horror far worse than bad weather. The true nightmare begins when the bird finds a master. To understand the Impundulu, you have to discard everything you know about standard monsters. The lightning bird does not live in the wilderness. It lives in the village. In the cosmological framework of Southern African traditions, the Impundulu is the ultimate familiar. It is the most powerful and dreaded servant of practitioners of dark magic, often referred to as ubutakati, or witchcraft. However, you cannot simply capture an Impundulu. It is inherited. The creature is bound by a strict matriarchal bloodline, passed down from mother to daughter across generations. This creates a terrifying social dynamic. In the eyes of those who believe the folklore, entire family lineages are quietly stigmatized, suspected of harboring an immortal weapon in their homes. The arrangement between the witch and the bird is a fragile, deadly symbiosis. The witch can command the Impundulu to ruin her enemies. She can order it to summon localized storms to destroy a rival's crops, strike a specific house with lightning, or systematically drain the life from someone she despises. But the bird is not a slave. It is a mercenary, and its currency is blood. The Impundulu possesses an insatiable vampiric hunger. To keep the creature docile and obedient, its master must constantly feed it. It demands a steady supply of human and animal blood. If the witch fails to provide adequate sacrifices, the creature's loyalty evaporates instantly. An underfed Impundulu is known to turn on its own master with merciless ferocity, tearing her apart or draining her life force entirely. Sometimes, when a witch dies before she can pass the bird to her daughter, the creature is left without an owner. It becomes what the Xhosa call an Isholugu, an untethered rogue monster of pure chaos. Without a master to direct its violence, the Isholugu wanders the countryside, killing indiscriminately and plunging entire communities into a state of absolute terror. And yet, the truly unsettling part of an Impundulu attack is that most victims never see a giant bird at all. What they see is far more insidious. If a massive thunder-generating bird of prey was flying through a village, people would naturally run and hide. The Impundulu bypasses this problem through a terrifying biological adaptation, shapeshifting. The entity is a master of disguise. While it can take various forms, its most effective and dangerous guise is that of a flawlessly beautiful, charming young man. In this human form, the Impundulu acts as a classic incubus. It infiltrates human society without raising a single alarm. It mimics human speech perfectly, adopts local customs, and utilizes its supernatural charisma to seduce women. Once it gains their trust and enters their homes, the trap is sprung. It waits until they are asleep before reverting to its predatory nature, paralyzing them and drinking their blood in the dead of night. The rules of its camouflage are strictly defined by the folklore. Only women, or highly trained traditional healers possessing mystical sight, are capable of seeing the Impundulu's true avian form. To the average man, the creature appears entirely human. This creates a terrifying psychological weapon. A witch can send her Impundulu, disguised as a handsome stranger, to court a rival woman, but the creature is also fiercely, violently jealous. It is known to target and brutally murder the human lovers of its mistresses, draining them of blood out of sheer spite. Historically, this belief had dark consequences. In some extreme, older variations of the myth, it was believed that the union between a woman and an Impundulu in its human form would result in monstrous offspring. Tragically, infants born with severe physical deformities were sometimes outcast or killed, as the community believed they were not human children at all, but the cursed spawn of the lightning bird. That should have been the end of the story, a terrifying fable about the dangers of trusting strangers. But the legend becomes much darker when you realize that the Impundulu was not entirely a myth. It was an ancient society's way of diagnosing a very real, very lethal threat. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, a silent, invisible killer was sweeping through the rural villages of southern Africa. Young, previously healthy men and women were suddenly wasting away. They would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. They complained of a crushing weight on their chests. They reported a sudden, sharp pain between their shoulder blades, and eventually, they began coughing up blood. Today, modern science recognizes these as the textbook clinical symptoms of pulmonary tuberculosis, a highly infectious bacterial disease that destroys the lungs. But before the widespread acceptance of germ theory, how did communities rationalize a plague that could silently wipe out half a household while leaving the house next door untouched? They looked to the shadows, and they blamed the Impundulu. From an anthropological perspective, the lightning bird is a masterpiece of medical rationalization. Every aspect of the myth perfectly aligns with the symptoms of TB. The feeling of suffocation, that is the invisible bird sitting on the victim's chest, stealing their breath. The localized pain in the back, that is the bird violently kicking the victim between the shoulder blades with its red talons. The chronic fatigue, the creature is slowly draining their blood. And the coughing up of blood? In the traditional diagnostic framework, hemoptysis, or coughing blood, was considered absolute, undeniable proof that an Impundulu was actively feeding on the patient. This myth allowed grieving families to make sense of senseless tragedy. It took a microscopic, terrifying bacterium and gave it a face. It gave it a motive. But this rationalization came with a devastating side effect. If the disease was caused by a magic bird, and the bird was controlled by a witch, then the disease wasn't an accident, it was an assassination. And that meant someone in the village was responsible. What happened next changed the legend forever, pulling the Impundulu out of the realm of folklore and directly into the courtrooms of the modern justice system. When you believe that your neighbor has dispatched an invisible vampire to suffocate your family, you do not wait for the police. You defend yourself. The belief in the Impundulu and the broader practice of witchcraft sparked a wave of real-world violence. Desperate individuals, convinced they were under metaphysical attack, began murdering those they suspected of harboring the lightning bird. In their eyes, killing the witch was not a crime. It was an act of preemptive self-defense, a necessary measure to save their own lives and the lives of their children. This created an unprecedented nightmare for the legal system in South Africa. The courts, operating on a Western legal framework, suddenly found themselves trying cases where the defendants openly admitted to murder, but pleaded not guilty by reason of supernatural self-defense. The crux of the legal battle revolved around the concept of the reasonable man. In criminal law, a defendant can sometimes be excused if they made a mistake of fact that any reasonable person would have made. In a landmark 1933 case, Rex v. Sembombela, the courts drew a hard line. A young man was accused of killing a child in a dimly lit hut. His defense? He genuinely believed the small shape was a tokoloshi, another feared supernatural creature. The court vehemently rejected the defense. The judge ruled that the standard of the reasonable man meant a man of ordinary intelligence, and that the superstitions or cultural beliefs of the accused could not be taken into account. Essentially, the court declared that a reasonable person does not believe in monsters. Yet, the courts could not ignore the cultural reality forever. The sheer psychological terror inflicted by the myth forced the legal system to bend. In another pivotal case, RVS Bayana, the accused brutally murdered an elderly woman who had been identified by a local diviner as a witch. She was accused of controlling an Impundulu and using it to kill the defendant's relatives. This time, the judge took a radically different approach. While the court could not condone the murder, the judge recognized that the defendant's belief in the Impundulu was so profound, so deeply ingrained, and so utterly terrifying that it constituted an extenuating circumstance. The judge noted that a crime committed by a person trapped in a state of permanent existential dread of a mystical predator is morally less reprehensible than a cold-blooded murder committed by a normal mind. The defendants were spared the death penalty. Tragically, this conflict is not ancient history. Even into the 21st century, the belief persists. In 2005, a South African man was convicted of culpable homicide after he beat a 2-year-old child to death, genuinely believing the toddler was a shape-shifted Impundulu that had come to destroy him. The myth has a body count. It ruins lives, tears apart communities, and baffles the justice system. But what if the people of Southern Africa didn't invent the Impundulu out of thin air? What if, somewhere in the brush, the lightning bird actually exists? Every legend has a biological anchor. For the Impundulu, That anchor is one of the strangest, most misunderstood birds on the African continent. If you travel near the freshwater wetlands of sub-Saharan Africa, you might encounter a bird known as the Hamerkop or Scopus umbretta. It doesn't look like a thunder god. It is a medium-sized, dusky brown wading bird, standing about 20 inches tall and weighing barely over a pound. It gets its name from its bizarre head shape, a long bill perfectly counterbalanced by a dense crest of feathers on the back of its skull, making its head look exactly like a heavy hammer. To the untrained eye, it's just a bird hunting for frogs and fish. But to those who know the folklore, the Hamerkop is the earthly manifestation of the Impundulu. The connection between this harmless brown bird and the terrifying vampire of myth lies in its incredibly eccentric behavior. First, there is its architecture. The Hamerkop builds the most massive, over-engineered enclosed nests of any bird in Africa, using sticks, mud, and debris. A single pair will spend up to 14 weeks constructing a domed fortress that can reach over 6 feet in diameter and weigh a staggering 400 pounds. The nests are so robust, they can easily support the weight of a grown man. Because of their massive size and hollow inner chambers, these nests often become a refuge for other animals, including venomous cobras, black mambas, monitor lizards, and barn owls. Imagine walking through the bush, peering into a bird's nest, and suddenly finding yourself face to face with a deadly snake. It is easy to see how locals began to associate the bird with dark magic and evil spirits. Then, there are the rituals. Hamerkops engage in bizarre, almost hysterical social gatherings. Up to 10 birds will gather in a circle, bowing to one another, running in rings, flapping their wings wildly, and loudly yapping at the sky. They will leap onto one another's backs in a chaotic frenzy of false mountings. To rural villagers, this didn't look like mating behavior. It looked like a witch's coven performing an occult ritual to summon the rain. Because of these strange habits, a powerful taboo developed. The indigenous San people of the Kalahari, along with the Zulu, believed that if you damage or destroy a Hamerkop's nest, the bird will retaliate by calling down a lightning strike to burn your house to the ground that very day. While this sounds like pure superstition, it acts as a brilliant, organic form of ecological conservation. Out of sheer terror of the Impundulu, local populations leave the Hamerkop and its nests completely alone, allowing the species to thrive undisturbed. The myth protects the bird, but the bird can no longer contain the myth. Today, the Impundulu has outgrown the wetlands of South Africa. It has slipped the bonds of rural folklore to become a global cultural phenomenon. The lightning bird is immortal, and it proves its immortality by adapting. It appears as a terrifying, blood-drinking antagonist in Marlon James Award, winning Dark Star Fantasy Trilogy. Hunting down heroes under the midday sun, it has been reimagined as a misunderstood, endangered magical creature in Jaco Jacobs' Bosellen middle grade novel, The Lightning Bird, and it has even conquered the elite art world. At the 2011 Venice Biennale, the acclaimed South African artist Nicholas Elabo suspended a massive cyclopean dragon made of black rubber tires and red satin ribbons from the ceiling of the exhibition hall. He named the sculpture after a Xhosa folk song. Impundulu zoechia ziendilandela. All the lightning birds are after me. It was a visual masterpiece that used the myth to explore themes of violence, mortality, and modern identity. We like to believe that as society advances, as we map the genome of tuberculosis and build lightning rods on our roofs, the ancient monsters will simply fade away. We categorize them as fables, box them up in encyclopedias, and convince ourselves that the night is safe. But the Impundulu reminds us that monsters are never just animals waiting to be discovered in the dark. They are the shape we give to our deepest anxieties. They are the manifestation of a sudden, unexplainable illness. They are the physical embodiment of the suspicion we hold against our neighbors. They are the terrifying, overwhelming power of a shattered sky. You may not believe in the bird that breathes thunder. You may not believe in the beautiful stranger who steals the breath from your lungs, But the next time the sky turns black, and the air pressure drops, and a sudden, violent crack of thunder rattles the windows of your home, ask yourself what is really out there in the dark. Because a myth can't kill you. But the things we invent myths to explain absolutely can.